Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls, and welcome to week 1 of the update 46 PTS. This goes live on June 2nd with a new zone, the new trial, and crucially, the new subclassing system. We already spent a lot of time fretting and voicing our concerns about this, what it will do to balance, power creep, and class identity, and it's way too early to say for sure, but I gotta admit, the initial response to the PTS has been very positive, at least from what I've seen. Anyway, those combat changes are probably the main reason you're here, so let's focus on that and deal with all the other stuff, and there is a lot of it, in a separate video coming as soon as possible after this one goes live. We're talking about a big nerf to Azureblight, big buffs to Nightblade, a very unexpected buff to Fate Carver, and a ton of other stuff. But first, the new sets. Overland sets are never going to be top tier, the harder it is to obtain, the more powerful it tends to be. But here we go. Light, just 300 to 350 magic recovery. Medium, crit chance when sustain is good, then switches to cost reduction when you might need it. Heavy, makes blocking cheaper and more effective while reminding you to use food. And the crafted set, only one this time, which is a good idea, increases your direct damage done to monsters by 12%, which is a pretty hefty amount. So if your guild gets a lot of new players, maybe keep this set in mind for characters that specialize in direct damage. The trial sets don't look all that exciting, but these are also some of the most likely things to change over the course of a PTS cycle. Harmony and Chaos is the light damage set, which boosts your weapon and spell damage whenever you take a synergy. If you can get one at least every 9 seconds, you can stack that 5 times. But right now it's only 86 per stack, so 430 max. That seems too small considering the requirements of the set to activate. So I would expect this one to be buffed, otherwise I don't see this being used at all. Caspian's Cruel Signet is the medium set. This one looks and sounds pretty cool, a potential replacement for Azureblight for multi-target fights, where AoE direct damage places these swords over enemy heads, which drop after 6 seconds and ramp up in damage depending on how many swords you have on different enemies at that time. Again, the tooltip seems to be quite low in week 1, I tested it in the new trial and the damage from the proc was terrible. Although the circumstances were not ideal, so maybe it's a bit stronger than it looks. Still, I know other people have tested this and it looks like this one might be bugged, or that it needs an upward adjustment. Recovery Convergence is the light support set. When your overheals reach 100,000 HP, you get access to a synergy which restores 6.9k Magicka and stamina to you and the entire group, with a 30-second cooldown. This is a cool concept, and a good healer could hit that 100k overheal target in seconds, but the cooldown is pretty long, so I don't know if it's going to be worth using over the dominant healer sets we currently have. Again, at first glance, it seems like that resource number could go up a bit, but even then it might go the way of Stone Talker from Rockgrove. It's good at what it does, but we generally want sustain to be good enough that we don't need what it does. Dolorous Arena is the heavy support set. When you're bracing, you gain a bit of armor and debuff the armor of enemies nearby. So kinda like Crimson Oath, but because the effect stacks, the overall armor debuff becomes quite a lot stronger at maximum. So there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with the numbers on this one, but the proc condition is a little weird. I don't know exactly how often I'm holding block when I'm tanking, but I'm pretty sure it's not enough to keep these stacks up. Perma blocking isn't really the way to go, except in really heavy damage phases, and those aren't super common, especially in dungeons where this is more likely to be used. But I will be interested in checking it out further. We've got 3 new mythics, Rakat's Void Mantle, a medium shoulder, which buffs heavy attack damage by 50%, and nerfs light attack damage by the same amount. Heavies no longer restore resources, but light attacks do. This may be a way to coax Oakensol users to try something different with their heavy attack setups, and maybe challenge that subset of the player base that seems strangely attached to Oakensol even though it's dropped so far from its glory days. Interesting mythic, maybe a bit too strong? Testing incoming. Mad God's Dancing Shoes, light shoes that do a random thing when you dodge, including creating an explosive cheese wheel under your enemy's feet. I played around with this one and it is pretty fun to use, and I know there are people who love these sort of fruit machine sets in PvP, although I think that cheese proc could be a little bigger. Monomyth Reforged is a ring that makes your front bar super offensive and your back bar super defensive. This is a classic PvP move, to switch bars situationally to gain the stats and effects which are most helpful to you moment to moment. This is like a supercharged version of that idea. Each bar also gets a drawback debuff, but I guess if you're really smart about when you go on the offensive, you will gladly take that trade-off. That's it for the new gear, and for the balance changes, I want to quote Gilliam from the patch notes. He admits that as exciting as this is, it's also a little scary. And when it comes to class abilities, many were originally designed to be outliers, to enable a class to stand toe-to-toe with others in certain aspects. These abilities are getting adjusted now that things aren't always as simple as, say, comparing Dragonknight versus Necromancer. This patch focuses on trying to bring into line many of those abilities, while also reinforcing the core themes of a skill line. We want to reiterate that this is very much a first stab at this new way to explore and exist in Tamriel. We will be looking at your feedback not only to guide adjustments during this update cycle, but future update cycles as well. So basically, don't freak out guys, we will keep iterating on this until we get it right. I mean, the freak out kind of already happened before the patch notes even arrived, but now the community has seen them, people are beginning to calm down, especially content creators and endgamers who often find it a bit easier to see through the fog on stuff like this. So let's break it down briefly because week 2 is already around the corner. There's a great explanation of the Necro bug which has been driving people crazy recently. I honestly suggest you just read this because it's such useful info. Thanks to Gilliam for taking the time to explain it here. Basically, the Necro banner was letting people hit a summons cap, so Blastbones wasn't able to spawn in. Now that's being fixed. They're also adjusting how the summons cap works, lowering it to 5 in PvP, but it remains 10 in PvE. But the main thing you need to know is that Blastbones should now work again. Now that everyone is going to have access to Shadowy Disguise, there are some updates to how sneaking and invisibility work with sticky abilities, both on the sneaker and the player trying to reveal them. Arcanist, Herald of the Tome. Fate Carver is now way more expensive, deals 8% more damage, and is capped at 6 targets. We get a bit more pen, and the Quintessence passive has been changed to a flat value instead of a multiplier. This is happening to a lot of passives, presumably to make it easier to balance consistently across the board. It's probably best to regard these changes as a lateral move for now, and not worry too much about whether they're a buff or a nerf. It depends on what your base stats are to begin with, and how many other modifiers are in play. As Gilliam remarked during our read-through, the old percentage bonuses were additive with other percentage modifiers, not multiplicative. The new flat values can now be multiplied by things like Major Slayer, so the exact impact of these adjustments is something we might have to come back to, and I'm sure it's also something the devs will be looking at if specific skill lines are underperforming or underrepresented. Just keep that in mind. Curative Rune Forms. Domain is now capped at 6 targets, which is a bit of a pain, but at least it's now easier to source, with this skill line available to every support. They also sorted out the healing priority on the Reconstructive Morph. Healing Tide's got a buff, and Clarity now restores both resources. Soldier of Apocrypha, the armor from Aegis got increased, but the sustain from Wellspring got reduced. Overall, the Arcanist still has some very powerful abilities, which are going to remain tempting for a lot of players when subclassing goes live. At least if it looks the way it does now. Rune Forms is going to be super popular for support because we're now going to need 2 domains in every group. The shields for tanks haven't been adjusted at all and remain very attractive, and some people are already talking about scaling Fate Carver back down because it's just going to be too dominant otherwise. We'll see. Dragonknight, Ardent Flame. We lost a bit of damage and quite a bit of sustain from combustion. That makes sense now that it's available to everyone, but it's a good example of how these skill lines have been able to create specific strengths and weaknesses within a class, like DK Sustain being dependent on this, and especially on Battle Roar. But now these passives are universal, they have to be adjusted, and that often means downwards. Warmth got changed. Instead of just snaring an enemy, it now increases their damage taken from all your Ardent Flame abilities by 6%. Considering how strong the damage abilities are in this skill line, that's potentially significant. Draconic Power. Leap got a bug fix, the healing from Burning Heart was reduced, Scaled Armor got buffed, and the health recovery from Elder Dragon got buffed as well. Earthen Heart. Magma Shell now suppresses ultimate generation, so you cannot gain any ultimate while this is active, the same way the Corrosive Morph already behaves. Magma Shell has been used a lot in Infinite Archive, also by beginner tanks who need that panic button while they're learning something, or by organized groups doing pushy strats to burn bosses like Reef Guardian, for example. These strats aren't necessarily completely dead, but you obviously won't be able to perma Magma Shell anymore, only use it sparingly and with a cooldown in between, so we might still see it used to speed things up here and there, but it will have to be in conjunction with off-tanks, boss swapping, that kind of stuff. Battle Roar also got reduced, again, because outside of the DK toolkit, it's just a bit too strong. Dragonknight was always going to be a tough one to balance in subclassing because it's so unique in how the class toolkit works. There's definitely still some attractive stuff in there, especially Stagger, Igneous Weapons, and some of the Draconic Power passives for tanking, but it's a bit spread out. Talons, for example, looks like it could go from an extremely powerful damage ability, which was practically mandatory on any DK that could sustain it, to being pretty much ignored because it sits in a skill line that damage dealers won't be that interested in. I expect we might see some more movement among the base game classes whose skill lines were always more of a mix, like when they swapped Nightblade's Veiled Strike and Blur a few patches ago. Necromancer, Gravelord. Flameskull and its morphs now always generate a corpse on the third cast, not just when Sacrifice is active. The execute from Death Knell got reduced, as many of us expected. It's now a flat 20% with any Gravelord ability slotted. I think this is fine, as it was quite restrictive and encouraged Necros to build with deliberately rubbish crit chance just so they wouldn't go over 100% in execute. Sustain from reusable parts got buffed, and the pen from Dismember got increased. Bone Tyrant. Major Main got added to Empowering Grasp, which could be pretty attractive for tanks. Healing taken from Health Avarice got increased by 50%, and the health from Last Gasp also got doubled. Living Death. Healing done from Curative Curse was increased, but near-death experience was reduced. The sustain from Undead Confederate was reduced as well. I think Necromancer still looks pretty good. The dot boost from Rapid Rot obviously needed to come down a bit, and like I said, I don't mind the change to the execute either. If anything, the worry is that it looks too attractive from a damage standpoint, especially with Rapid Rot affecting two of the most desirable damage abilities in the game, Radiant Oppression and Fate Carver. I do want to see things balanced, but I don't want to see Necro become bland. It's such a specific playstyle choice, and it should absolutely feel impactful. Nightblade. Assassination. Master Assassin got an awesome change. Crit chance when we're flanking instead of penetration, which, let's face it, is often useless if your group is properly comped, or when you're brawling in PvP. Critical chance has felt quite low in recent metas, and a lot of players hate the inherent crit farming that this leads to, so this is a welcome new option. They got rid of the longer stun when you melee attack from stealth. That was kinda nice if you were ganking an inexperienced player, but the vast majority would just break free immediately anyway, and to be honest, I'm not sure that most players understand the whole sneak stun to begin with, so this is fine. Pressure points got an increase, even more crit chance for slotting stuff in this skill line, and Grim Focus got a major overhaul. You can still fire it at 5 stacks, but now it stacks all the way up to 10, so you can build it up and fire it twice in your opening burst and during off-balance phases, or you can just sit on it and never use it at all if you want to keep things really simple. In exchange, the stat boost per stack has been lowered on both morphs, although the Stamina morph still remains slightly stronger in this regard, while the Magicka morph hits harder when you fire it. They also ditched the permaglow effect. You can get rid of it now. I kinda liked this and thought it was funny how upset people were getting on the forums about it, but it did look weird sometimes when your weapon was hidden or when it interfered with another cosmetic, so this works. Shadow. The extra health from slotting shadow abilities was almost doubled to 5%. Siphoning. Catalyst. The passive that gives you ultimate when drinking a potion got buffed. I know we were all worried it would get nerfed, But hey, I don't hear anyone complaining about this. Magicka Flood now applies to both resources, but doesn't add as much as it did before. So Nightblade skill lines still don't look that enticing for tanks, but both healers and DDs are salivating over these changes. Assassination is now probably among the strongest competitors for pure damage passives, and none of the active abilities have been nerfed either. Siphoning is going to be more attractive than ever for pillager supports. Again, we'll see how it goes during later weeks. Maybe Grim Focus will get tuned down a bit, but none of this feels particularly broken. It's just when you combine it with other stuff that the crazy potential emerges, and that's the scary part of the job that Gilliam refers to in these patch notes. Sorcerer, Daedric Summoning. There's a big thing about the removal of the whole no pet sorc idea, as that no longer has any reason to exist. I've always argued that it was a little unnecessary. Surely if you're so desperate for a Magicka user who doesn't use pets, just make a Templar. It's just another area of the ESO forums that's always baffled me, but anyway, that problem should be solved with subclassing. So the passives and morphs which gave you conditional bonuses, depending on whether you had pets or not, are basically gone. Daedric Prey, as many of us suspected, has been changed so it only affects Sorcerer pets, so it won't work with Blastbones or the Warden Bear. I mean, that would have been silly, and they would have had to gut Daedric Prey so it wouldn't be completely out of proportion. Instead, they actually buffed it by another 5%, probably since having pets is so much more of a sacrifice now that 18 other skill lines just became available to the Sorc. There was some lamentation that more of the Infernal won't be buffed by this anymore, but the devs have already said they're ready to look at this and maybe make some exceptions to the type of pet that qualifies. Conjured Ward no longer heals you if you don't have a pet. The resources we get back from the rebate passive got a nice increase. Daedric Protection now reduces damage taken instead of health and stamina recovery. Expert Summoner now increases all 3 resources by 5%, rather than just 10% health. And Bound Armaments got the same treatment as Nightblade's Grim Focus. You can now stack it up twice, so fewer casts are going to be wasted, but the damage per dagger was reduced by 10%. Dark Magic. Crystal Fragments can now activate even when you're not on the same bar as the ability. Nice change. The reduced cost from Persistence also got a buff. Storm Calling. Hurricane got a small fix. Mage's Fury, the class Execute, got its activation window reduced. That's mostly a PvP thing and a very welcome change. The recovery from Capacitor and the damage stats from Expert Mage also got the flat bonus treatment instead of the percentage increase they used to offer. I think this might be the class that loses the most from subclassing as it currently stands. I'm not too worried, and if you're a Sorc enjoyer, I don't think you should be either. Even if it takes them a patch or two, they should figure out a way to make the Sorcerer skill lines appealing for certain roles. With the exception of Arcanist and its short life in the game so far, Sorcerer has undoubtedly been the most spoiled class in the history of this game. I love playing it, both Magicka and Stamina, and I'm gonna miss those specific combat loops more than I'll miss some of the others. But right now, it doesn't look super compelling. Again, maybe they'll need to look into some of these abilities hopping between skill lines so they become a bit more enticing. The Daedric Summoning skill line is still going to be a strong contender for any Sorcerer character, but Crystal Shard is kinda on its own over in Dark Magic, surrounded by support and utility skills. I would expect some tweaks to this class as subclassing evolves. Templar, Aedric Spear. Puncturing Strikes, both morphs, now deal pure AoE damage, which is a pretty massive buff in the right situation, and the single target damage is unchanged. Sweeps now heals for less, but against multiple targets the total healing should actually go up. Jabs now has a higher chance to apply Sundered, one of the most valuable status effects. Burning Light, the passive damage, got a scaling tweak, but is broadly the same and also has a higher chance to apply status effects. Minor Berserk got added to Spell Wall, the crit damage from Piercing Spear was increased 20%, Spear Shards now deals more damage over time, and the upfront hit on Blazing Spear got reduced to compensate. Overall, the ability will hit about 10% harder. Dawn's Wrath. Again, a buff that no one expected. Radiant Destruction now lasts almost 5 seconds, now costs Magicka per tick and hits about 12% harder than it did before. The scaling kicks in a little later at 39% for Oppression and 30% for Glory. The Glory morph also got cheaper rather than restoring Magicka when you cast it. Basically, this Execute has become much more restrictive to use, but is stronger than ever. Restoring Light. The Mending passive now affects all healing. Light Weaver now activates an auto block when you're channeling, for example if you're using the Vampire Drain as a tank or you're playing a heavy attack build. It will only trigger every 15 seconds though, which makes it tricky to rely on when you need it. The Templar definitely looks interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if that AoE spammable starts to compete with Fate Carver for multi-target fights, especially if the latter does get tuned down a bit in the coming weeks. The super long Radiant Oppression takes a bit of getting used to, and we'll see if it's going to be balanced in this form or not, but two of the Templar skill lines are at least potentially tempting for damage, even if the picture isn't quite as exciting in other areas. Warden. Animal Companions. Bond with Nature heals for more. We get increased sustain from Flourish. An advanced species offers even more critical damage than it did, which makes sense given that subclassed Wardens now have a lot more juicy options competing for space on their front bar. The active abilities haven't been changed at all. Green Balance. The free sustain from Nature's Gift became more generous, and the healing bonus from Emerald Moss also got an increase, while heavy attacks won't heal as much with Lotus Flower as they did previously. Winter's Embrace. Northern Storm, the ultimate, got increased in damage overall, but now lasts much longer, so it won't be as useful in as many situations as before, such as trash pulls, where it can actually perform pretty well, but it might not be a bad choice in multi-target boss fights, which last longer. We'll have to see about that, but it certainly looks like that's the intention here. Frozen Gate got some fixes. The Glacial Presence passive now makes it even easier to apply Chilled. Frozen Armor now grants more armor than it did. Icy Aura now applies a passive Major Maim, which could be very nice for main tanks in tough fights. And Piercing Cold now increases block mitigation 8% rather than 12%, but is no longer dependent on your health being over 30k. It also increases your frost damage by 10% rather than all damage by 8%. Hard to see this as anything but a nerf, especially with only 2 damage abilities in this skill line and all the incentives to choose other options. Maybe that 10% figure just needs to go up a bit, or if they're worried about the implications in PvP, there can be a separate one for monsters. Warden certainly looks capable. The Green Balance skill line and the minor toughness that comes with it remain a must for at least one of your healers, and it's cool that that will now be available in all dungeon groups without needing a Warden support specifically. The addition of Major Maim to Winter's Embrace is interesting alongside the other nice tanking tools in there, but it will probably be chosen primarily for the Frost Cloak, which is still the only group-wide source of Major Resolve. We'll see about the Frost Mage fantasy thing and how strong and viable that really is, but at the end of the day, people who follow themed builds tend to do so for role-playing and fun rather than for pure optimization. That's it for the class overhaul. There is a huge amount to take in here, and that's why it's taken me a few days to get this video up. Plus the fact that we've been running the new trial in the evenings, which seems excellent so far. Again, that'll be covered in a separate video coming in the next day or two with all the content and quality of life stuff that we can expect from Update 46. Meanwhile, there are a few more combat changes we have to mention. Ulfsild's Contingency, the Mage's Guild Scribing skill, became more expensive, especially versions with a shield or a heal attached, so you can't spam this as easily anymore. Banner also got changed to drain resources every 2 seconds rather than lowering your recovery. On low recovery builds, this clearly makes it harder to use, but it kinda makes the banner more universal as well. Although the main issue there is not sustain, but the relative value of the class mastery script for different classes. This remains one of the only things that is completely defined by your base class. If you want to use the Arcanist or Necro class mastery script, you'll have to use an Arcanist or a Necro, not another class which has subclassed one of their skill lines. The same is true of class sets from Infinite Archive, those are also fixed. And of course, there's the fact that you must always keep at least one of your class's original skill lines as well. So there are some limitations. There were some fixes and minor changes to Highland Sentinel, Noxious Boulder, Mad Tinkerer, but the big news for existing sets is that Null Arca finally got a buff. The buggy proc was fixed last patch, which did lead to a drop in power, but the set was still more than okay for certain situations where other sets weren't going to work. But now they've increased the damage by 8% and reduced the cooldown by 20%. That's roughly a 25% damage increase, which is comparable to what it lost in a lot of situations and even more in some cases. So Null Arca should definitely be worth hanging on to now for situations where neither Riptide nor Reliquin really makes sense. Azureblight also changed so that the stacks are tracked per player rather than group-wide. As disruptive as this may be to a lot of groups that are really leaning on this set right now to prog tough content, we've all got to admit it's been overpowered for a really long time. Zos points out that with enough people wearing Azureblight, it starts to outperform single target sets against single target bosses, which is clearly not the intention. It'll be interesting to see what other sources of big cleave we can come up with, but it is worth remembering that Fate Carver got a bit of a buff, the Templar Spammable got a big buff for cleave, and the new medium set, Caspian's Cruel Signet, could replace some of that AoE proc damage functionality if they can get the tooltip in the sweet spot. But it does proc off direct damage and not from dots. We'll see what happens. And with that, I will say a big thank you to everyone who supports Ninja Pulls and makes it possible for us to put out videos like this. Another one coming soon, so please become a monthly supporter here on YouTube, Twitch, Ko-fi or Patreon. We appreciate all of it immensely. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.